the office of Speaker of the House of the United States House of Representatives is hereby declared vacant.
What's paralyzed the House of Representatives has been the failure of Speaker McCarthy.
We are not saving Kevin McCarthy.
We need an actual leader.
When the Speaker makes a promise to either side of the aisle, they ought to keep it.
If the whole government is going to turn on a handful of people whose allegiance is not to America, not to freedom, not to democracy, but to Donald Trump, then we have a problem.
As I walk out of this chamber, I feel fortunate to have served the American people.
Hello, and welcome back to another show of Watching Washington. It's Friday, October 6th, and I'm Lily Grove.
And I'm Allison Lynn. Here's a look at the big stories of the week.
On Tuesday, October 3rd, Republican Representative Kevin McCarthy was ousted as Speaker of the House of Representatives. This is the first time in our nation's history that the Speaker of the House has been voted out of their position, according to a source from NBC News. The vote to force McCarthy out of speakership came after Florida Representative Matt Gaetz filed a resolution on Monday. He said the basis for the motion to vacate is Kevin McCarthy's repeated breach of agreement that he made in January. That's according to a source from NPR. The final vote in the House on Tuesday was 218 to 208, with 8 Republican representatives solidifying the vote alongside Democrats. Following this historic vote, McCarthy spoke to reporters about the decision to remove him from speakership and demonstrated his peaceful transition of power.
I do not regret negotiating. Our government is designed to find compromise. I don't regret my efforts to build coalitions and find solutions. I was raised to solve problems, not create them. So I may have lost a vote today, but as I walk out of this chamber, I feel fortunate to have served the American people.
The House is now without leadership. Representative Patrick McHenry of North Carolina is taking over temporarily. Voting will begin next week to determine who will be the next Speaker of the House.
The battle is now underway for a new Speaker of the House. Republicans who have announced bids are Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise. Whoever wins will face the same dilemma that doomed Kevin McCarthy and plunged the House into chaos.
Meanwhile, the 8 GOP lawmakers who sunk McCarthy are now facing retribution. CNN congressional correspondent Lauren Fox has the latest.
Anger and raw nerves plaguing the House GOP after the historic vote to oust former Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
I'm not surprised. Tensions and tempers have been running pretty high for the last 9 months.
Allies of McCarthy are seeking retribution from the 8 Republican rebels who voted against him.
I think it was done for narcissistic, for selfish reasons, for fundraising reasons.
They delivered a not-so-veiled threat to cease all fundraising for Republican Representative Nancy Mace ahead of the vote. In return, Mace says she's fundraising off her decision to sink McCarthy.
I'm taking it from all sides right now, and because of the threats that I've been receiving over the last couple of weeks, it finally reached a point last night where I was like, you know what, I'm going to let people that know that I need help.
Now, some are even threatening to try and have them removed from the Republican conference.
I don't see how they can really be part of a conference when they they come on the inside, listen to what's going on, and go outside and lob bombs in the middle.
The very people who are blaming the 8 who voted against Kevin McCarthy are the same people who have held up this process so that we don't get to the point where we pass a budget, pass appropriations bills, and deal with the huge spending.
McCarthy, too, is seeking revenge against Democrats for not throwing him a lifeline during the vote. 2 Republican sources tell CNN he was behind the move to kick former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and former Majority Leader Steny Hoyer out of their unofficial office spaces near the House floor.
Rather than being petty and silly, and throwing Nancy Pelosi out of her office, I mean, how does that contribute to civility up here?
Even though Republicans are bitterly divided, the race to elect the next speaker is in full swing. 2 leading contenders for the role are emerging, including House Republican Majority Leader Steve Scalise and Representative Jim Jordan. Scalise was shot in 2017 at a baseball practice ahead of a congressional charity game that left him in critical condition. In August, Scalise revealed he was diagnosed with blood cancer.
He's leader of Scalise. He's a good friend. I've had a great conversation with him, with Jim, with Kevin, other people. We're working hard. We're going to unite.
House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan was one of the co-founders of the Conservative Freedom Caucus and is a close ally of former President Trump.
I think we're a conservative center-right party. I think I'm the guy who can help unite that.
Speaker McCarthy has been ousted, but who pushed McCarthy out in the first place? Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida filed the motion to remove McCarthy. Gaetz is a prominent figure in the House and is well known for his far-right views. The self-proclaimed Florida man is also a controversial representative, with numerous investigations centered on his own alleged misconduct, ranging from sex trafficking, sexual misconduct, misuse of campaign funds, and more. However, Gaetz uses this attention as a focal point for his position within the government, suggesting that people just want to smear him, a similar strategy to the one former President Donald Trump uses, whom Gaetz is an avid supporter of. As the country approaches a shutdown, the representative stands that he is acting in the interests of the American people and Republican voters, even if the threat of shutdown continues.
Today, we have an update on last week's government shutdown drama. Late Saturday night, Biden signed a temporary funding bill into order to keep government agencies open. They had little time to spare, but Congress did manage to approve a bipartisan deal. This deal relied heavily on dropping aid for Ukraine, but it did increase federal disaster assistance by $16 billion. Biden was not satisfied with cutting Ukraine funding and expected House Speaker McCarthy to introduce a new bill in the meantime to keep funding for Ukraine going without interruption. We've seen a lot happen in this past week, McCarthy being removed from House Speaker, which now leaves a lot of uncertainty onto what will happen with Ukraine and other upcoming appropriation bills. The continuing resolution that passed extends the deadline for government funding decisions until November 17th. Many concerns have been raised on whether this will be enough time for Congress to agree to a plan that satisfies enough of the representatives to pass, or if we should still be concerned about a government going through the shutdown later this year. In an interview shortly after the continuing resolution passed, Representative Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey, shares his opinion on the matter.
I think first to your point, and thanks for having me, yesterday was a win for reasonableness and common sense over extremism, right? The extremists lost. But to your point, the challenge is we have to get out of this cycle of insanity. We can't live 45 days to 45 days. We have to focus on real issues for the country and enough of this squabbling and absurdity. So, my number one focus when we get back tomorrow is making sure that we can develop a process that gets us past this 45-day government shutdown, looks at longer-term solutions on our appropriations process, and fights for issues that people care about and that they're focused on. And so that's going to be our number one focus when I get back.
Many factors are looming over the heads of Americans since this interview as the House Speaker position opens up, placing yet another decision on the House of Representatives before a permanent government funding decision for the next fiscal year can be put into place. We will keep you updated on all their upcoming decisions. Just tune back in next week. Stay with us now because up next, President Biden continues to aid college students in debt.
Plus, a new bill might just make Katy Perry roar. Stay with us to find out why. More Watching Washington next.
Are you looking for a new hobby?
Or you want to have a fun evening with your friends?
Then come climb to new heights at the Co-Rec Climbing Wall.
This week, President Biden announced another cancellation of student loans. This particular cancellation will total up to $9 billion. This month will be the first time about 28 million borrowers will be required to repay their student loans since the deferments were granted for student loan repayment during the COVID-19 pandemic under the Trump administration. This debt relief means that borrowers in certain categories are now eligible for complete forgiveness. This even includes borrowers who have been in repayment for at least 20 years. The White House says it's making fixes to a broken student loan system. There are many other relief plans in the works, notably plans that will lower borrowers' monthly payments. Many of these student loan forgiveness plans are ultimately in the hands of the Department of Education. These new changes would require a formal rulemaking process.
Sam Bankman-Fried, founder of the FTX, one of the largest failed digital currency exchange platforms, have begun his trial centered around conspiracy of fraud. Bankman-Fried has pleaded not guilty to 7 counts of fraud and money laundering. Prosecutors say the former founder of FTX stole billions of dollars of customer funds for his own personal use. He is also accused of using money to cover up losses from a crypto hedge fund he controlled. This trial would make for one of the biggest fraud cases in U.S. history. If convicted, Bankman-Fried could be sentenced to life in prison.
According to CNN, Dianne Feinstein, a longtime California senator, died last week at 90 years old and was laid to rest Thursday in San Francisco. Feinstein was born and raised in San Francisco and was the first female mayor of the city for 10 years, later moving on to a U.S. Senate position for more than 30. Many gathered at the front steps of San Francisco City Hall on Thursday in remembrance of her and her legacy. San Francisco Mayor London Breed, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Feinstein's granddaughter spoke at the service. Although he was unable to attend, President Biden stated that Feinstein was a remarkable person and a kind and loyal friend. The memorial service was closed to the public, and the Senate floor closed on Thursday to provide members the opportunity to honor Feinstein and all she had accomplished.
This week, a top Pentagon official was charged with dogfighting. Deputy Chief Information Officer for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Frederick Moorfield Jr., and Mauro Flythe allegedly used an encrypted messaging app to talk with people across the country about dogfighting bets, dogs that died from dogfighting, and media reports about people charged with dogfighting. The U.S.
Federal
Attorney's
charges
Office
for 2
stated
Anne Arundel County men accused
Moorfield
of
and
possessing,
Flythe
training,
used
and
the
transporting
Monikers
dogs for
Jihad kennels and
dogfighting.
razor-sharp kennels to
Suspects are
identify their
62-year-old
dogfighting
Frederick
operations,
Moorfield of Arnold
according to
and
the District
49-year-old
Attorney's
Mario
Office.
Flythe of Glen
The
Burnie.
District Attorney's Office
Investigators
also
say
found a
Moorfield
contraption
operated
made
under
with
the
an
name
electrical
Jihad
plug
Kennels,
and
and
jumper
Flythe
cables
used the name
allegedly used
Razor
to
Sharp
kill
Kennels.
dogs that lose
Charging
fights.
documents identify
Moorfield and
Moorfield as a
Flythe
Deputy
will
Chief Information
remain unreleased
Officer
from
in the
custody
Office of
pending
the
a trial.
Secretary of Defense.
Katy Perry and husband Orlando Bloom find themselves embroiled in a legal battle regarding a $15 million California property, which could result in a new act in California law. The Katy Perry Act, or the Protection of Elder Realty and Retirement Years Act, is a motion that would grant elders in California increased protection of their financial interests in realty. This comes following a years-long battle between Perry and Carl Westcott. He's a California veteran who had been under intense medication during the time of the sale of his property, a sale he would go on to state that he did not want to sell his home at all. This would not mark the first time Perry has found herself in a legal battle over real estate. The last trial featured Perry going to war with a convent, which led to a nun collapsing in the courtroom before passing away shortly after. This act would establish a 72-hour cool-down in which either party can review and possibly resend an offer if the property owner is over the age of 75. This act is stated to target rampant elder abuse in the state of California, all on the account of a pop star. More than 75,000 healthcare workers walked off the job Wednesday morning in what is being called the largest healthcare strike in U.S. history. The strike comes after unionized healthcare workers, including nurses and EMTs, failed to negotiate new contracts with Kaiser Permanente. The majority of affected facilities are in western states, including California, Oregon, Colorado, and Washington. Workers are also striking in Virginia and Washington, D.C. Unionized staff are asking for increased pay, job protections, and solutions to fix labor shortages. Kaiser Permanente representatives say negotiations are available around the clock to continue bargaining until an agreement is reached. The healthcare strike is temporary, and Kaiser Permanente workers will return to work October 7th.
Amphibians around the globe are facing a rapidly approaching extinction crisis. A recent global assessment has revealed that 41% of the amphibian species under scientific scrutiny are now on the brink of extinction. This is a stark increase from the 39% reported in the last assessment conducted back in 2004. Junjie Yao, a frog researcher from Duke University, emphasizes that amphibians are the world's most threatened animals. Their unique biology and permeable skin make them very sensitive to environmental shifts. This crisis is fueled by several factors, the most impactful being habitat loss due to human development and farming. Other contributions come from pollution, bacteria, and fungal infections, as well as heightened swings in temperature and moisture levels due to climate change. The study found that the greatest concentrations of at-risk amphibian species in the Caribbean islands, the tropical Andes, Madagascar, and Sri Lanka. Other locations with large numbers of threatened amphibians include Brazil's Atlantic forest, southern China, and the southeastern United States.
The Washington Post reports early data that shows this past September shattered the global heat record for the month by a record margin. The average temperature for the planet this September beat the previous record for the month by more than half a degree Celsius. This is the largest monthly margin ever observed. According to other data, temperatures around the world in September were at levels closer to what is normal for the month of July. These September records come after the planet's temperature reached its warmest level on record over the summer. We have a special guest in the studio with us this week.
Here to discuss last month's G20 summit, Purdue professor Dr. Reed Kurtz. He's standing by with Washington's Cole Sand. Cole?
Thank you. That's right. I've got Dr. Reed Kurtz with me today to discuss the topic of international relations, specifically the recent G20 summit that happened in September. Dr. Kurtz specializes in environmental politics, international relations, and political theory. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Now, before we discuss any policies or anything, I want to acknowledge that some of our viewers may not be familiar with what the G20 summit is. So would you be able to give a brief description of what the summit is?
Sure. So the G20 is it's an informal organization or an informal summit, a group of the 20 largest economies in the world. It emerged at the end of the 1990s after a series of economic crises, including the Asian financial crisis. It's also somewhat of a successor to the G7 or the G8, which were the 7 or 8 largest economies. And it's somewhat notable in that it's more of an informal grouping of countries. It doesn't have a treaty or a formal organization associated with it like the United Nations.
Okay, amazing. Now, one of the main agreements from the G20 summit this year was the goal to triple the renewable energy capacity by 2030, but no plan was put into place. Do you find this to be a recent theme of recent G20 summits?
So it may be worth having a little bit of context about what this renewable energy goal is trying to achieve. So the United Nations and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has indicated that in order to meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 or under 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we need to cut global greenhouse gas emissions basically in half by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. So we have very stringent necessities from an ecological perspective in meeting these goals. And so we can see this as basically an attempt to try and scale up renewable energy to meet these goals. But as you kind of indicated, the fact that we have acknowledgement of the necessity for pursuing these goals, but we're also lacking the kind of concrete policies and plans to tackle this. This is symptomatic, we might say, of, again, kind of broader tensions and contradictions in the international system, where, again, our international system is largely predicated upon, again, the exploitation of fossil fuels, and there's very powerful interests who, again, are deeply indebted to this. And so, basically, it's not entirely surprising that we have, again, basically these goals, but a lack of ambition and concrete steps to meet them.
Yeah. Well, do you think as we get closer to irreversible damage to our planet, we'll actually find more urgency in trying to achieve these goals from the G20 members?
So unfortunately, one thing to keep in mind is that we already are facing irreversible damages to our planetary environment. So again, we've just experienced the hottest summer on record. Climate scientists are telling us September was the hottest September on historical record as well. The IPCC in their latest report, which came out back in the spring, already indicated that many of the changes that we're already experiencing are effectively irreversible within the next couple centuries or millennia. So the climate change is already here. And so I think what the thing we need to be keeping in mind is it's not just about these ecological thresholds or points, but we need to be more attentive maybe to the social impacts and how our groups of people and how our, again, the different populations who are most affected by climate change, how are they responding and what kinds of challenges is that going to pose for governments? And so until we see effective action that's going to, again, create the impetus for governments to change their behavior, we shouldn't necessarily expect more concrete commitments, to be frank.
Okay. Well, we've talked about climate change. I want to shift the conversation to the Ukraine and Russia conflict and how the G20 members tackled that. G20 members condemned human suffering and adverse repercussions of the conflict in Ukraine on global food and energy security, without actually mentioning Russia specifically. Now, Ukraine was less than happy with this statement, and they argued that it would have been beneficial to have a Ukrainian representative present. Do you agree with Ukraine on this?
So it's perhaps maybe worth kind of stepping back a little bit and thinking about the role of India in leading this summit. So for Narendra Modi, who is the current Prime Minister of India, he wanted to use the summit as an opportunity to basically bolster both his kind of geopolitical position or the geopolitical position of India vis-a-vis China and the United States, or more broadly, the West. And so I think he was very strategic in terms of, Ukraine wasn't formally invited to the conference. And so that, from the outset, already kind of set the stage in terms of what those dynamics were going to play. India is also, again, suffering significantly from the impacts on global food prices due to the conflict. And so by basically issuing a statement that acknowledges, that was able to get the all of the G20 members on board, but at the same time kind of falling short of condemning Russia, it's basically kind of a way for Modi to signal that he can help provide kind of a counterbalance to, again, these kind of competing geopolitical forces, not just between China, the United States, and the West, but also, again, Russia and the West more generally. And so from the standpoint of Ukraine, we might be able to say that they should have had a chance to participate in this. At the same time, it's hard to say whether or not that would have actually led to a significantly different outcome, because I think at the end of the day, there wouldn't have been a statement released at the end, and you might say that there might have been less progress than what was actually achieved in the first place. Yeah. So certainly you might say that they ought to have been considered, but in terms of India's interests, it's not entirely clear that that would have actually served their interests, having them in part.
Okay. Yeah. So was there anything specific that you want to see from this summit, and did it happen?
So just to be honest, I tend to have pretty low expectations for these types of summits. It's not, I don't want to, dismiss them as inherently ineffective, because in some sense it's better to have states come together to exchange, to dialogue. It's better to maintain these lines of communication open. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't have any illusions as to what their purposes ultimately serve. And again, if we're talking about the 20 largest economies, we're talking about effectively estimates somewhere between 75 and 80% of the global economy is represented amongst these larger states. They do have a vested interest in the status quo. But we are, again, at a kind of an interesting turning point, to put it lightly, in terms of world history, where the international system, there are a number of crises that are convulsing the system. Climate change is, perhaps maybe the ecological crisis that binds them all together. But there are economic crises relating to inflation. There's food price crises in much of the global South. There's general political instability, the rise of these populist movements and such. And so there's, in other words, significant recognition that the status quo has to change, but it seems equally clear that the primary actors responsible for maintaining that status quo are not going to be necessarily the ones we should look to effectively change that. So then it raises the question of, again, what are the role of social movements? What are the roles of, again, the potential for mass mobilizations of people to press for change? And this is, again, perhaps another maybe benefit of having these conferences and summits, is they do provide focal points for communities to organize and resist. So we do also see large protests and mobilizations that take place alongside them as well. But again, thus far, the people who organize these conferences, the states and the interests that organize them, they're effectively, it's like they're steering a ship through a storm, but they're not necessarily effectively addressing what the root causes of those storm conditions are.
Yeah.
Which again poses very significant questions about the long-term viability of, again, not only these types of summits, but again the stability of the international system itself.
Yeah. You talked about a lot of current issues. What can we expect for next year's G20 summit in 2024? It's going to be in Brazil. There's going to be a new member. Talk to me about that.
So what's kind of interesting in terms of the G20 is I think there's a kind of a renewed focus on the global South. And so again, we just saw India hosting the G20 summit. It'll be held by Brazil and President Lula, who has again taken over after the right-wing administration of Jair Bolsonaro. After that, it'll be moving to South Africa. So this might provide an opportunity for many of these large developing economies to kind of reassert their status and to try and offer effectively their alternative to the Washington consensus and the kind of more neoliberal economic system that's been in place and that the G20 effectively emerged out of. At the same time, again, I think we should expect a lot of the same types of issues to be on the agenda, especially in terms of food security. Inflation is going to continue to be a significant issue in many parts of the world. Economic instability. One thing that perhaps we might look to next year, I would expect to see a little bit more focus on environmental issues, given the progress that Lula has made in addressing deforestation, which was a very significant problem under the previous administration in Brazil. It can also be an opportunity to put, again, maybe a more social and environmental and economic justice perspective on the agenda, given, again, Lula's political leanings in contrast to Modi, who's much more kind of a right-leaning authoritarian figure. Lula comes more out of the large-scale workers' movements in Brazil. So there might be more opportunities there. But again, thinking about these broader geopolitical dynamics, we shouldn't expect too much in terms of change to the underlying dynamics that we've already been seeing.
Awesome. Well, amazing. Thank you so much for answering all my questions. It was a great interview.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Well, that's all for this edition of Watching Washington, and we will be back next week.